Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the sleepy town of Ashmere, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, there existed an antique shop known as Evershaw's Curiosities. The shop was run by an eccentric old man named Mr. Evershaw, who collected objects from distant places and bygone eras. Locals rarely ventured inside, as it had an air of mystery that made people uneasy. But one fateful day, a peculiar object arrived, a relic that would change the town forever. It was an unassuming day when the package arrived. Wrapped in layers of thick cloth and sealed with wax, it bore no return address. Curious, Mr. Evershaw unwrapped it to reveal a small, ornate box made of dark wood, carved with symbols he didn't recognize. The latch was rusted, but when he opened it, he found a stone amulet inside, a smooth black oval with a single crack running through its center. As soon as he touched it, he felt a chill run down his spine. Dismissing the sensation as his imagination, he placed the box on a shelf near the window and continued with his work. What he didn't notice was how, for a brief moment, the air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. Later that afternoon, a young couple, Daniel and Clara, entered the shop. They were planning to redecorate their new home and were hoping to find something unique. As they browsed the shelves, Clara's attention was drawn to the wooden box. "Look at this," she said, picking it up carefully. "It's beautiful, don't you think?" Daniel frowned. "I don't know. Something about it feels off." Clara rolled her eyes. "You always say that when I like something." "No, I'm serious. I think we should leave it." His voice was unusually sharp. Clara felt a sudden rush of irritation. "Why do you always have to ruin things?" Before they knew it, they were arguing, their voices echoing through the shop. Mr. Evershaw, startled by the sudden tension, approached them. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Both Daniel and Clara paused, confused by their own behavior. They muttered apologies and left, leaving the wooden box behind. Over the next few days, the strange relic began to exert its influence beyond the shop. Customers who entered Evershaw's Curiosities left feeling uneasy, as if they had forgotten something important or had quarreled without knowing why. Word spread quickly, and fewer people visited the shop. Meanwhile, those who had come into contact with the relic found themselves plagued by distrust. Daniel and Clara, once a happy couple, began fighting constantly. Their arguments became more heated, filled with accusations and doubts. "You never listened to me," Clara snapped one evening. "Maybe you never wanted this house in the first place." Daniel's face hardened. "Maybe I didn't. Maybe I made a mistake being with you." Their words, sharp and cruel, cut deeper than they intended. Both felt as if they were losing control of their emotions, but neither could understand why. As days turned into weeks, the town of Ashmere descended into chaos. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for years began accusing one another of petty thefts and slights. Friends became enemies and families were torn apart by suspicion. The local council meeting, usually a dull affair, devolved into a shouting match over trivial matters. People who had always trusted one another found themselves unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, that those closest to them were hiding something. At the heart of it all was the wooden box in Evershaw's shop. Desperate to understand what was happening, Mr. Evershaw reached out to an old friend, Professor Lillian Hartwell, a historian who specialized in ancient artifacts. Lillian arrived a few days later, intrigued by the strange events. "This box," she said, examining it closely, "is unlike anything I've seen before. These symbols, they're ancient, possibly predating recorded history." She opened the box and stared at the amulet inside. As soon as she touched it, a wave of distrust washed over her. She glanced at Mr. Evershaw and, for a brief moment, felt an irrational suspicion that he was hiding something from her. Shaking off the feeling, she said, "This isn't just an ordinary relic. It's cursed." After hours of research and poring over old texts, Lillian discovered the origin of the relic. It had once belonged to a nomadic tribe that believed in powerful spirits of discord. According to legend, the amulet had been cursed by a shaman who sought revenge on a rival tribe. Anyone who came into contact with it would be consumed by distrust and paranoia, eventually turning on those they loved. The only way to break the curse, Lillian explained, is to destroy the amulet. But it won't be easy. Cursed objects like this have a way of protecting themselves. That night, armed with hammers and firewood, Mr. Evershaw and Lillian prepared to destroy the amulet. As they approached the box, they felt the curse's power intensify. Whispers filled the air, voices urging them to turn on each other. "You're hiding something from me," Lillian said suddenly, her voice cold. Mr. Evershaw shook his head. "No, it's the curse. Don't listen to it." For a moment it seemed as if the relic would win, but with great effort they focused on their shared goal. Together they lifted the amulet from the box and placed it on the firewood. As the flames consumed it, the air grew heavy, and a piercing wail echoed through the shop. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the tension vanished. The air felt lighter, and the whispers ceased. With the amulet destroyed, peace returned to Ashmere. Relationships that had been strained began to mend, and the townsfolk slowly forgot the strange events that had plagued them. Daniel and Clara, realizing how the relic had affected them, worked to rebuild their trust. Mr. Evershaw closed his shop for a time, wary of the dangers lurking in ancient curiosities. Lillian returned to her studies, determined to learn more about such cursed objects to prevent future disasters. But somewhere, in a distant land, another relic lay hidden, waiting to be found. An object of power and peril, its curse ready to spread once more. And so, the tale of the relic of discord became just another forgotten legend, waiting for the day it would be rediscovered. In the quiet seaside town of Blackwater Cove, legends of restless spirits were common, whispered from generation to generation. Among them, the most feared was the story of Mira, a spirit said to cause vivid, horrifying hallucinations of her death to anyone who entered her domain. Unlike ordinary ghost tales, this one had a peculiar twist. The victims didn't just see Mira's death, they felt it. Many years ago, Mira was a young woman who lived in Blackwater Cove. She was known for her kindness and beauty, but her life ended in tragedy. Mira was betrothed to a fisherman named Ewan, a man she loved deeply. One stormy night, Ewan went to sea, despite the dangerous weather, promising Mira he'd return by dawn. But Ewan never came back. Heartbroken and consumed by grief, Mira would sit by the cliffs every night, gazing at the ocean, hoping to see Ewan's boat. One night, in a moment of despair, she slipped, or perhaps jumped, off the cliffs into the churning waters below. Her body was never found, but since that night, strange occurrences began in Blackwater Cove. Those who walked near the cliffs reported seeing a pale figure staring out to sea. Others claimed they felt an icy presence following them, but the most terrifying experiences were reported by those who ventured too close. They would suddenly be overwhelmed by hallucinations, reliving Mira's final moments as though they were happening to them. In the present day, the story of Mira had faded into folklore, told around campfires or as a cautionary tale to keep children from playing near the dangerous cliffs. However, strange events started occurring once more. Dylan, a local journalist, became interested in the legend after hearing about a group of hikers who fled the cliffs in terror, claiming they had seen Mira and felt themselves falling into the ocean. Dylan was skeptical but curious. He had always been fascinated by the unexplained and felt this could be his chance to write a story that would make his career. He gathered a group of friends, Lena, Marcus, and Rachel, and proposed they investigate the cliffs at night. "You really think there's a ghost up there?" Lena asked, skeptical but intrigued. "I don't know," Dylan admitted, "but something's scaring people, and I want to find out what." The four friends set out on a cold, foggy night, armed with flashlights and a recording device. The cliffs loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, with the sound of crashing waves echoing below. As they walked, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence fell over the group. "This place gives me the creeps," Rachel whispered. "It feels wrong." They reached the spot where most of the sightings had been reported, a jagged outcrop overlooking the sea. Dylan set up his recorder while the others scanned the area. "Do you think she's really here?" Marcus asked nervously. Before anyone could answer, Lena gasped, "Look!" They all turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long dark hair blowing in the wind. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were fixed on the horizon. "It's her," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the figure turned toward them, and the air grew colder still. Before they could react, the world around them seemed to shift, and they were no longer standing on solid ground. Each of them found themselves alone, trapped in a nightmarish vision. Dylan was standing at the edge of a stormy sea. He could feel the rain lashing his face and hear the distant cry of seagulls. He looked down and saw the waves crashing against the rocks below. He felt an overwhelming sense of despair, as if he had lost someone he loved dearly. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the ground. Meanwhile, Lena found herself in a dark room, the walls closing in around her. She could hear a woman sobbing, the sound growing louder and more desperate with each passing moment. "Who's there?" she called out, but her voice echoed hollowly in the empty space. Marcus was standing in a dense fog, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. He felt cold hands brush against his skin and heard whispers all around him, taunting, pleading, accusing. Rachel, on the other hand, found herself submerged in freezing water. She could feel the icy grip of the ocean pulling her down, her lungs burning for air. She struggled to surface, but no matter how hard she tried, the water dragged her deeper. In the midst of their terror, a single sound cut through the chaos, a soft, mournful song. It was Mira's voice singing the same song she used to hum while waiting for Ewan. The melody seemed to reach into their minds, calming their fear. Slowly, the hallucinations began to fade, and they found themselves back on the cliff, shivering and pale. "She's trying to tell us something," Dylan said, his voice shaking. "She's not just haunting this place. She's trapped here." "But why make people see her death?" Marcus asked. "What does she want?" "She's reliving her final moments," Lena realized. "She's showing us what happened to her, hoping someone will understand." Determined to help the spirit find peace, Dylan and his friends researched Mira's story further. They learned about Ewan's disappearance and discovered that his boat had never sunk. Instead, he had survived the storm, but had been unable to return due to a broken mast. By the time he reached another shore and returned to Blackwater Cove, Mira was already gone. Armed with this knowledge, the friends returned to the cliffs one last time. Dylan spoke aloud, addressing Mira's spirit. "Mira, Ewan didn't abandon you. He survived and he came back. He loved you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew warm, and the figure of Mira appeared once more. But this time, instead of looking mournful, she smiled, a sad, grateful smile. Slowly, she faded away, her form dissolving into the wind. The strange occurrences at the cliff ceased, and Blackwater Cove returned to its peaceful existence. Dylan's story about the haunted cliffs became famous, but he always felt that the real victory was helping Mira find peace. The legend of Mira became just another tale told to tourists, no longer a warning of terror, but a story of love, loss, and a spirit finally set free. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely by the cliffs, you could still hear the faint echo of a woman's song, carried gently by the wind. Ashbourne was once a bustling city of innovation and culture. Its skyline was adorned with glittering skyscrapers. Its streets thrummed with life, and its people reveled in the progress they were making toward a bright future. But all of that changed on a fateful day, the Day of Ash as it came to be known. No one knew what truly caused the catastrophe. Official reports claimed it was a chemical plant explosion. Others whispered of an ancient curse unearthed during construction on the outskirts of the city. Whatever the truth, the result was undeniable. A cloud of thick gray ash covered the entire city, choking out life, leaving behind silence and shadows. In the days following the event, rescue teams entered the city in search of survivors. What they found instead chilled them to their core. Buildings stood eerily intact, but no one was there. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty streets covered in ash. Even more disturbing were the strange phenomena reported by the rescuers. One team swore they saw figures moving behind the windows of an office tower, but when they went inside, they found only empty rooms. Another team claimed they heard voices, whispers calling their names from the shadows. Some rescuers fled in terror, refusing to return. Others simply disappeared. The government soon declared Ashbourne a no-go zone, cordoning off the entire city. But that didn't stop curiosity seekers, urban explorers, and thrill seekers from venturing into the haunted ruins. Among those drawn to Ashbourne's mystery was Daniel Harper, a documentary filmmaker obsessed with uncovering the truth behind urban legends. He assembled a small team of like-minded individuals. Jess, a tech expert who believed every mystery had a rational explanation. Ethan, a historian fascinated by the city's past. Maria, a medium who claimed she could communicate with spirits. Alex, a skeptic who joined for the thrill. "This is our chance to document something incredible," Daniel said as they stood before the barricades that marked the edge of the city. "If the stories are true, we could be the first to capture proof of the paranormal. Or we could be the next group to vanish," Alex muttered, but he followed nonetheless. Crossing the barrier felt like stepping into another world. The air was thick with the smell of ash and decay. The streets were silent except for the echo of their footsteps. Shadows stretched unnaturally long in the dim light, and every corner seemed to hide something just out of sight. Maria paused, her face pale. "They're watching us." "Who?" Jess asked, her voice tense. "The souls trapped here. They're everywhere." Daniel pointed his camera at Maria. "What do they want?" "To be heard, to be remembered." As they ventured deeper, they began to notice strange things. In one building, they found a dining table set for dinner, plates filled with food that hadn't rotted, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-meal. In another, they discovered a playground where the swings moved on their own, creaking in the still air. Ethan found a diary in a ruined apartment. The last entry read, "The ash is everywhere. We can't breathe. The shadows are moving. They're coming for us." Night fell quickly, casting the city into darkness. Their flashlights flickered as if something was draining the energy. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, always just out of reach. Maria grew increasingly agitated. "They're closing in," she whispered. "We need to leave." But it was too late. A dense fog rolled in, obscuring their path. Out of the fog emerged figures, pale, translucent forms with hollow eyes. The air grew freezing cold, and the team's breath came out in visible puffs. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman in a tattered dress. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it echoed as if carried by the wind. "Why have you come?" Daniel stepped forward, his hands trembling but determined to get answers. "We want to know what happened here. The ash, it consumed us," the woman said. "It trapped us between life and death. We cannot leave. We cannot rest." Maria clutched her head. "They're angry. They want revenge." "Revenge for what?" Ethan asked. "For being forgotten," Maria said. "For being left here to rot." As the spirits grew more agitated, the team realized they had to act quickly. Jess, using her tech expertise, managed to trace the location of the chemical plant where the disaster had originated. They decided to head there, hoping to find something that could give the spirits closure. Reaching the plant was difficult. The fog thickened and the spirits grew more aggressive, their whispers turning into wails. Alex was the first to break, running off into the darkness despite the others' warnings. They never saw him again. When they finally reached the plant, they found the source of the ash, a massive crack in the ground emitting a faint, unnatural glow. Ethan examined the area and found ancient markings etched into the walls. "This wasn't just a chemical accident," he said. "This is ancient. Someone tried to seal something here, and we broke it open." Maria nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It's a curse. The spirits aren't just victims. They're part of the curse. Until it's sealed again, they'll never rest." Using the markings as a guide, Maria instructed the team to perform a ritual to reseal the crack. As they worked, the spirits surrounded them, their wails growing louder, their forms becoming more solid. The ground shook, and ash swirled around them like a storm. Just as it seemed they would be overwhelmed, Maria completed the ritual. A blinding light erupted from the crack, and the spirits let out a final, mournful cry before vanishing. The fog lifted, and the city grew still once more. Daniel's team barely made it out of Ashbourne alive. They never found Alex, and Maria refused to speak of what she had experienced. Daniel released his documentary, but few believed his story. The government maintained its cover-up, and Ashbourne remained off limits. But Daniel knew the truth. The city was still haunted, not by vengeful spirits, but by the memory of what had happened. And sometimes, on quiet nights, he could still hear the faint whisper of the ash, calling out from the ruins of a forgotten city. For Ashbourne was a place where the past refused to die, a city haunted not just by ghosts, but by the weight of its own history. For centuries, the legend of the Spectre's Tide haunted the coastal village of Grey Harbor. Locals whispered of a cursed vessel that vanished in a violent storm 300 years ago, its crew lost to the abyss. Some believed the ship had been doomed by the wrath of the sea gods. Others claimed it was cursed after stealing a forbidden treasure from a distant island. Whatever the truth, one thing remained constant. Whenever a dense fog rolled in from the sea, villagers locked their doors and refused to venture outside, fearing the ghostly ship's return. It was an unusually cold summer evening when the first signs appeared. A thick, unnatural fog crept into the harbor, blanketing the water and shoreline. The lighthouse's beam barely penetrated the haze, and the usual hum of evening activity died down as the villagers hurried indoors. Amelia Rowe, a young woman who worked at the local tavern, noticed the change in the atmosphere. Her grandfather, a retired sailor, often told her stories of the Spectre's Tide. She never believed them, dismissing them as seafaring tales meant to frighten children. But that night, something felt different. "It's just fog," she told herself as she closed the shutters of the tavern's windows. Yet an unshakable feeling of dread gnawed at her. Across the village, others shared her unease. Fishermen tethered their boats tightly, and old men muttered prayers under their breath. In the distance, the mournful toll of the lighthouse bell echoed across the water, a sound meant to guide lost ships. But tonight, it seemed to serve another purpose, a warning. Around midnight, the fog thickened and the air grew heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Amelia, who couldn't sleep, stood by her window staring out at the harbor. Suddenly, a shape began to emerge from the mist. At first, it seemed like an ordinary ship, but as it drew closer, Amelia's heart raced. The vessel was ancient, its wooden hull blackened and waterlogged, covered in barnacles and seaweed. Its sails, tattered and ghostly pale, flapped in a wind no one could feel. "The Spectre's Tide," she whispered, her voice trembling. The ship glided silently into the harbor, as if propelled by an unseen force. No one was on deck, yet Amelia felt eyes watching her from the shadows. The air grew colder, and a strange rhythmic creaking echoed across the water, like footsteps moving below deck. She ran to wake her grandfather, who bolted upright at her frantic knocking. "It's here, grandfather! The ghost ship! It's real!" The old man's face paled, but he grabbed his coat and lantern without hesitation. "Stay inside, Amelia. No good ever comes from meddling with the dead." Despite her grandfather's warning, Amelia followed him to the harbor. A few other villagers had gathered, drawn by the ship's eerie presence. They watched in silence, too afraid to approach. Without warning, the ship's gangplank lowered with a groan, and figures began to emerge. The crew of the Spectre's Tide stepped onto the dock, their forms translucent and shimmering in the pale moonlight. They wore the tattered remains of old naval uniforms, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. One by one, they moved in unison, as if bound by some unseen command. At their head was Captain Elias Greaves, a tall, imposing figure with a tricorn hat and a skeletal hand gripping a rusted cutlass. "3 centuries beneath the waves," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And now we return to claim what was taken." "What do you want?" a brave villager called out, though his voice quivered with fear. "Our lives were stolen by greed," the captain said. "We were cursed to sail the depths forever, seeking that which was lost." The villagers exchanged fearful glances. Some turned and fled, but Amelia stood her ground. "What was lost?" she asked, stepping forward. The captain's hollow gaze fell upon her. "The relic, the golden idol of the sea god. It was stolen, and for its theft, we were condemned." Amelia's grandfather stepped forward, his lantern casting flickering shadows across the dock. "I remember the tales," he said. "The idol was said to have been brought back by the first settlers of Grey Harbor. They hid it, fearing its curse." Captain Greaves nodded slowly. "Return the idol, and we shall depart. Fail, and we will remain forever. A cold wind swept through the crowd, carrying with it the scent of brine and decay. Amelia's heart pounded. The villagers began murmuring, their fear palpable. "We don't even know where it is," one of them cried. "The church," Amelia's grandfather said suddenly. "The old church on the hill. It was said to be buried beneath the altar." Without hesitation, Amelia and her grandfather led the way to the crumbling remains of the church, the villagers following closely behind. The ghostly crew remained at the harbor, their glowing eyes fixed on the retreating figures. Inside the ruined church, Amelia and her grandfather worked quickly, prying up the old stone slabs of the altar. After what felt like an eternity, they uncovered a small, ornate chest. Inside lay the golden idol, its surface tarnished but unmistakably radiant. Amelia felt a strange pull as she gazed at it, as if it were calling to her. Her grandfather wrapped it in cloth before she could touch it directly. "Let's end this," he said, his voice firm. They hurried back to the harbor, where the crew of the Spectre's tide awaited them. Captain Greaves stepped forward, his skeletal hand outstretched. Amelia's grandfather placed the idol in his hand. As soon as the captain touched it, a bright light enveloped the ship and its crew. The villagers shielded their eyes as a deafening roar filled the air. When the light faded, the Spectre's tide was gone, along with its cursed crew. The fog lifted, revealing a calm, starlit sea. Gray Harbor never saw the Spectre's tide again, but the legend lived on. Amelia became known as the woman who helped break the ancient curse, and the village returned to its peaceful existence. Yet on foggy nights, some claimed they could still hear the faint creak of a ship's mast and the distant echo of Captain Greaves's voice, forever bound to the sea. For the dead may rest, but their stories linger, whispered by the wind and carried by the waves. Nestled in the middle of a dense forest, far from the nearest town, was Midnight Amusement Park, a place shrouded in legend and mystery. It was said to be unlike any other theme park, both thrilling and terrifying, not just because of its rides, but because of the ghostly presence that lingered there. What made the park even more notorious was that it only opened its gates once a year, on Halloween night. Those brave enough to enter were promised an unforgettable experience, but there was always a price to pay. Stories circulated about guests who never returned and others who came back changed, unable to speak of what they had witnessed inside. No one knew who owned the park or how it came to exist. It simply appeared decades ago, and every year, like clockwork, the gates would creak open at the stroke of midnight on Halloween. For thrill seekers and ghost hunters, it was the ultimate challenge. This Halloween, a group of friends, Ethan, Lila, Mason, and Chloe, decided to take on the infamous park. They had grown up hearing the tales and had always dreamed of experiencing it for themselves. When they received a mysterious black envelope in the mail, they knew it was their chance. The envelope contained 4 golden tickets and a cryptic message. "Enter if you dare, but beware what lies within. Midnight strikes and your fate begins." Despite the eerie warning, the group was excited. "It's just a gimmick to scare people," Mason said, stuffing the ticket into his jacket pocket. "We'll go in, ride a few spooky rides, and leave with some cool stories to tell." Chloe, the most skeptical of the group, rolled her eyes. "I'm only coming because you'll need someone to keep you from freaking out." With that, they packed their flashlights and set off toward the forest. As they approached the park, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring the towering iron gates. Beyond the gates, they could see the outlines of towering roller coasters, carousels, and fun houses. A cold wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of carnival music. The gates creaked open on their own as they stepped forward, as if inviting them inside. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but pressed on, their excitement mingled with fear. Once inside, they found the park eerily empty. The rides stood silent, and the only sound was the faint hum of the music, which seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "It's creepy," Lila admitted, clutching Ethan's arm. "Let's check out the roller coaster," Mason suggested, trying to keep the mood light. But as they walked deeper into the park, strange things began to happen. Their first stop was the haunted funhouse, an old, decrepit building with shattered mirrors and peeling paint. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, locking with a loud click. Okay, not funny, Chloe said, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the mirrors flickered, showing distorted images of the group. Their reflections didn't mimic their movements. Instead, they seemed to move independently, waving and smiling in unnatural ways. "Let's get out of here," Ethan said, his voice trembling. They turned down a narrow hallway lined with more mirrors. This time, instead of their reflections, they saw ghostly figures staring back at them. The figures wore vintage clothing, their eyes hollow and lifeless. A voice echoed through the funhouse. "You shouldn't have come." Panic set in, and they ran, finally bursting through a side exit that led them back into the open air. Breathing heavily, the group stumbled upon a carousel. Unlike the funhouse, this ride was still functioning, its painted horses moving up and down as the platform turned in slow circles. But there were no operators, no visible power source. "Maybe we should keep moving," Lila suggested nervously. But before they could leave, the carousel ground to a halt, and the horses turned their heads toward the group, their eyes glowing red. Without warning, the carousel spun to life, faster and faster, creating a vortex of wind that sucked them toward it. They clung to each other, struggling to resist the pull. Finally, the ride stopped, and the wind died down. "This place isn't normal," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "We need to find a way out." As they wandered the park, they noticed that time didn't seem to move. Their phones had no signal, and the clocks in the park were stuck at 11:59 p.m. Then a loud bell tolled, signaling midnight. With each toll, the park seemed to change. The once silent rides creaked to life, shadows danced across the grounds, and ghostly figures began to appear. Spectators of a time long past, trapped in the park's cursed grip. The friends tried to run, but no matter which way they turned, they found themselves back at the center of the park. The ghostly crowd grew denser, their faces emotionless, their eyes fixed on the living intruders. Desperate, the group remembered the message on the invitation. "Your fate begins." "What if we're supposed to find something, or do something to leave?" Lila suggested. They searched frantically until they found a small booth labeled Fortune Teller. Inside was a crystal ball that glowed with an unnatural light. A ghostly figure appeared behind the glass. "To leave, you must play the final game," it intoned. "A question must be answered. Why does the park open only once a year?" The group looked at each other, terrified but determined. "Because it's cursed," Ethan said. "It traps the souls of those who enter." The figure smiled, and the crystal ball shattered. Suddenly, the park began to dissolve around them, the rides and ghosts fading into mist. The gates reopened, revealing the dark forest beyond. Without hesitation, they ran through the gates, collapsing in the grass outside. When they turned back, the park was gone. Only the fog remained. The group never spoke of that night again, but they knew they had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. Midnight Amusement Park remained a legend, one that no one dared to challenge again. But every Halloween, as the clock struck midnight, those who listened closely could still hear the distant sound of carnival music and the whispers of the lost souls trapped forever in the haunted park. In a remote mountainous region, known for its treacherous weather and jagged peaks, lay the wreckage of Flight 432, a passenger plane that vanished without a trace over 2 decades ago. Despite numerous searches and investigations, the plane's disappearance remained one of aviation's greatest mysteries, until it was finally discovered by accident. A group of hikers stumbled upon the crash site deep in the forest. The skeletal remains of the aircraft rested half buried in thick vegetation, its fuselage split open like a gaping wound. Nature had claimed the wreck, vines coiling around the wings and shattered windows. But what disturbed the hikers the most wasn't the wreckage. It was the eerie silence and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. News of the discovery spread quickly, attracting reporters, investigators, and thrill seekers. Yet those who ventured close to the site often returned with strange stories, or didn't return at all. Several weeks after the crash site was found, a team of paranormal researchers led by Dr. Eleanor Graves, an experienced investigator of supernatural phenomena, arrived. Dr. Graves was drawn to the case not only by the tragedy, but by the reports of ghostly apparitions and unexplained occurrences near the wreckage. "We're here to find answers," she told her team as they prepared to set up camp a short distance from the site. Accompanying her were Mark, a tech expert, Sarah, a historian specializing in aviation accidents, and James, a skeptical journalist hoping to debunk the supernatural claims. Despite their different motivations, they shared a sense of foreboding as they approached the twisted remains of Flight 432. That night, the team gathered around a campfire, discussing the history of the doomed flight. Sarah recounted the known details. Flight 432 was en route from New York to Seattle when it suddenly lost contact with air traffic control. There were no distress signals, no mechanical warnings, just silence. When it failed to arrive, search efforts were launched, but no trace of the plane was found. It was as if it vanished into thin air. Until now, Mark added, adjusting his camera equipment. As they spoke, a chill wind swept through the forest, rustling the leaves and extinguishing part of the fire. James, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off, but Eleanor noticed something strange. The temperature had dropped significantly, far more than it should have. Later that night, as the team prepared to sleep, they heard faint whispers carried on the wind. The voices seemed to come from the direction of the wreckage. Despite their fear, they decided to investigate. With flashlights in hand, the team moved cautiously toward the wreckage. The twisted metal gleamed under the moonlight, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As they drew closer, Eleanor suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves. Then faintly they heard it, a soft, echoing sound, like distant voices calling out. Mark pointed his camera toward the wreck, adjusting the night vision. "I'm getting something," he said. Through the lens, he could see faint figures moving among the debris, translucent shapes resembling passengers in old-fashioned clothing. Some appeared confused, while others wandered aimlessly. One figure, a woman clutching a child, seemed to notice the team. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking with Eleanor's. Though her face was expressionless, an overwhelming sense of sorrow radiated from her. The following day, the team continued their investigation. Sarah unearthed an old pilot's logbook near the cockpit. Though weathered and partially destroyed, parts of it were still legible. The last entry reads, "Severe turbulence, loss of control, something's not right." "It ends abruptly," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. As she flipped it through the pages, a sudden gust of wind blew through the area, scattering loose papers. The air grew heavy, and the team felt an oppressive presence. Mark's equipment began to malfunction, the camera flickering on and off. "I think we're being watched," James muttered, his skepticism waning. Moments later, they saw him, a figure in a pilot's uniform standing near the cockpit. Unlike the other apparitions, he appeared more solid, more aware. His eyes glowed faintly as he raised a hand, pointing toward the dense forest beyond the wreckage. "What's he trying to show us?" Eleanor wondered aloud. Following the ghostly captain's gesture, the team ventured deeper into the woods. After several minutes of hiking, they discovered something shocking, a second wreckage site. This one was smaller, a military aircraft hidden beneath decades of moss and leaves. "This must have collided with Flight 432, Sarah speculated. "It explains why they lost control so suddenly." Eleanor nodded, and the spirits of the passengers remain because their story was never told. They're trapped here, reliving their final moments. As if in response, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the sound of the same whispers they had heard the night before. But this time, the voices were clearer. "Help us!" Determined to bring peace to the restless souls, Eleanor and her team conducted a ritual to acknowledge the tragedy and honor the dead. They lit candles around the wreckage, recited prayers, and placed the pilot's logbook at the center. As the ritual concluded, the air grew still. One by one, the apparitions appeared, standing silently as if waiting for something. The ghostly captain stepped forward, nodding in silent gratitude before fading into the night. The others followed, their forms dissolving into mist until nothing remained but the wreckage and the quiet forest. When the team returned to civilization, they reported their findings. While the official story cited severe turbulence and mechanical failure, the truth of what happened that night remained known only to them. James, once a skeptic, published an article titled "The Spirits of Flight 432, detailing their harrowing experience. Though few believed the supernatural elements, the story brought closure to the families of the passengers. Years later, hikers who ventured near the site claimed they no longer felt the oppressive presence that once haunted the area. The ghosts of Flight 432 had finally found peace, thanks to those who dared to listen. But on stormy nights, some say you can still hear the faint echo of voices on the wind, a reminder of the lives lost and the secrets buried in the heart of the forest. In a distant valley surrounded by jagged mountains and dense forests lay the forgotten ruins of Dunhaven, an ancient kingdom once known for its mighty warriors. Centuries ago, Dunhaven had fallen to invaders in a brutal war. Legends whispered that its army, led by the formidable General Ronan Balthor, had fought to the last man, refusing to surrender even when their fate was sealed. Despite their bravery, Dunhaven's forces were overwhelmed, and the kingdom was reduced to ash. As time passed, Dunhaven became nothing more than a ghost story, a tale told to frighten children. But in the quiet village of Greywatch, nestled at the edge of the valley, strange things began to happen. It started with whispers in the wind, distant echoes of marching footsteps, and ghostly lights flickering in the darkness. The villagers, once skeptical of the old legends, soon found themselves gripped by fear. One night, Eamon, the village blacksmith, was closing his shop when he noticed something unusual. A thick fog had rolled in from the valley, denser than he had ever seen. As he strained his eyes, he saw figures moving within the mist, silhouettes of men clad in ancient armor, their weapons glinting faintly in the moonlight. Eamon stumbled back in terror, slamming the door shut and locking it. He could still hear the faint clinking of armor and the steady rhythm of marching feet outside. By morning, the fog had cleared, but word of Eamon's encounter spread quickly. "They're back," whispered Mira, the village elder. "The fallen warriors of Dunhaven. They've returned to claim what was once theirs." According to Mira, the army of Dunhaven had been cursed. When General Ronan and his soldiers perished in battle, their souls were bound to the land they had sworn to protect. Unable to find peace, they became a ghostly legion, waiting for the day they could rise again and reclaim their homeland. "Every 100 years, the curse grows restless," Mira explained. "If they cannot reclaim Dunhaven, they will bring death and ruin to anyone in their path." The villagers, terrified by the prospect of facing a ghostly army, begged Mira for guidance. She told them of an ancient ritual that might appease the spirits, but it required someone brave enough to enter the ruins of Dunhaven and face General Ronan himself. Eamon, despite his fear, volunteered. "If there's a chance to stop them, I'll do it," he said. He was joined by Leora, a skilled archer, and Bryn, a scholar who had studied ancient curses. Together, they set out toward the valley, carrying with them a relic said to belong to Ronan, a golden medallion engraved with the symbol of Dunhaven's royal crest. As they entered the valley, an unnatural chill filled the air. The once lush landscape was now barren, and the ruins of Dunhaven loomed ahead like a forgotten tomb. Night fell as the trio approached the heart of the ruins. The air grew thick with tension, and the sound of marching grew louder. Emerging from the shadows, the ghostly army appeared. Their translucent forms shimmered in the pale light, their eyes glowing with an eerie blue hue. At their head was General Ronan, clad in black armor, his spectral sword gleaming ominously. "Who dares trespass on sacred ground?" Ronan's voice boomed, echoing across the ruins. Eamon stepped forward, holding up the medallion. "We come seeking peace," he said. "Your people have suffered long enough. Let us end this curse." Ronan's gaze fell upon the medallion. For a moment, silence reigned, but then he spoke. "Peace was denied to us when we fell. Our homeland was taken, and our honor was lost. We cannot rest until justice is done." Bryn stepped forward. "If we cannot undo the past, perhaps we can honor your memory by ensuring your story is told and your legacy preserved." Ronan considered Bryn's words. "If you wish to end the curse, you must prove your worth. Face me in combat, and if you prevail, we shall be at peace. But if you fail, your souls shall join ours in eternal unrest." Despite the odds, Eamon agreed to the challenge. Leora and Bryn watched anxiously as Eamon squared off against the ghostly general. Though Ronan's form was ethereal, his strength was undeniable. Every clash of sword and shield sent shockwaves through the air. Eamon fought with everything he had, remembering the stories of Dunhaven's brave warriors. Though he was no legendary soldier, his determination burned brightly. After a grueling battle, Aemon managed to knock the sword from Ronan's grasp, holding his own blade to the ghostly general's chest. Ronan smiled faintly. "You have fought with honor, as my men once did. Perhaps it is time we found peace." He knelt before Aemon, and the ghostly army followed suit. One by one, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the wind. As dawn broke over the valley, the ruins of Dunhaven were bathed in golden light, and for the first time in centuries, the land felt at peace. The villagers welcomed Aemon, Leora, and Brynn as heroes. Though the ruins remained, the valley began to thrive once more, and the tale of the fallen legion became a story of bravery, honor, and redemption. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, some say you can still hear the distant echo of marching feet, a reminder of the ghostly army that once returned to reclaim their homeland.